There are places everyone seems to love. I still can't figure out why.
America Viva. On the road, talking about lived history, remarkable places, and real life.
Hello and welcome to On the Road. I've traveled to more than 60 countries, mostly across North and South America, but also throughout Europe where I was born and grew up. And when you travel that much, some places completely blow you away, while others are endlessly hyped. And you find yourself wondering, what exactly is everyone so excited about? That's what today's episode is about. 5 places that are considered dream destinations by millions of people, but that I think are widely overrated. Berlin was a place I longed for years. I grew up in provincial Germany in a town called Bochum. And back then Berlin was, to me at least, the only real German metropolis. West Berlin, of course. I first went there in 1977 or 1978 for an Iggy Pop concert. After that I kept returning during the punk and new wave era. The SO36, a club called Jungle, bands like Malaria, Dina Testbild and Einstürzende Neubauten. It was an incredible time. The living conditions, on the other hand, were less incredible. I stayed with friends who had moved to Berlin and usually lived in some courtyard apartments with no proper heating, just coal stoves. And anyone who has experienced a typical Berlin winter with temperatures of minus 20 degrees centigrade, that's not exactly fun. Berlin really started to annoy me in the 1980s when more and more of my friends moved there. Whenever they came back to visit the Ruhr Valley, they had suddenly started speaking the Berlin dialect. Icke, Jurke, that kind of thing. It was as if they had adopted completely a new identity, and probably they have. Back then, Berlin seemed to consist most entirely of newcomers. The city had a special political status in the Cold War era. If you lived there, you didn't have to do the military service or alternative civilian services. There were tax advantages. And you even got a special Berlin allowance on top of your salary if you had one. It attracted a certain type of people. Looking back now, I'd say it attracted a remarkable number of people who hadn't really succeeded anywhere else. And who wouldn't. That for me was the beginning of the problem. A city that was dependent on subsidies from West Germany over decades was never really forced to develop either a strong economic or a genuine cultural elite independent from government support. After unification, that changed for a while. Around the turn of the millennium, I was in Berlin a lot. Once again, friends of mine had moved there, this time to Neukölln, what you probably wouldn't do today anymore. And they showed me a different side of the city. International, culturally incredibly diverse, and at the same time, ridiculously cheap. Exactly the kind of combination that attracts artists and creative people from all over the world. And it did. For a few years, Berlin had something that hardly any other European city or maybe city in the world had. Later I started attending the ITB regularly, the International Tourism Exchange in Berlin, held every year in March. And year after year I had the feeling that things were getting worse. Public transportation was a disaster, more and more neighborhoods looked run down, train stations and public squares became places you didn't particularly want to spend time in. And at the same time, Berlin kept getting more and more expensive. Today I sometimes wonder whether what's going wrong in Germany right now has something to do with Berlin being the capital. That shrugging indifference, that astonishing ability to fail at even the simplest tasks has always been one of Berlin's defining characteristics for me. And sometimes I get the impression that this mentality has spread through politics and the entire machinery of government. Maybe that's what has always bothered me most about Berlin. It tended to attract the wrong people and at the same time it had a strange ability to change the people who moved there. Prague was kind of a trauma for me for a long time. When I was in high school, we had to choose for a class trip. The options were London, which was during the punk era just fantastic. A ski trip to the Dolomites in Italy, which sounded fantastic. And Prague. Back then, Prague was still part of the communist Eastern Bloc. But it had a reputation for being freer and more exciting than most other cities behind the Iron Curtain. And where did I end up? Lake Geneva, with my advanced math class that I had foolishly chosen. We visited, among other things, a computer center with our math teacher, whose name was Spies and who behaved exactly like a military guy. It was a thoroughly miserable experience. With one exception, Blondie happened to play in Geneva, and a friend of mine and I sneaked out of the youth hostel at night and went to the contest. That at least saved the trip a little. After that, it took a very, very long time for me to get to Prague. Sometime around 2007 or 2008, I was doing research in the Upper Palatine region of Germany and thought, why not keep going? And let me say this, Prague is beautiful. The old town is one of the most beautiful historic centers I've ever seen, but it's unbelievably crowded. Masses of people stream across Wenceslas Square, which is really more of a boulevard, and through the narrow streets of Old Town. You hardly see any locals. Everything feels a bit like a movie set. I kept wondering, do people actually live here? Or are they actors in a giant Truman Show who appear every morning so that everything looks like Prague for the tourists? The peak of the experience was the Charles Bridge. I shuffled across it in a human traffic jam. That's how crowded it was. I made it to the other side and eventually fought my way back. Today there's a word for this that wasn't used much back then, over-tourism. And for me, Prague is almost the perfect example for that. A place becomes famous because it has something unique. So everyone wants to go there, and because everyone wants to go there, it eventually becomes so crowded that the very thing that made it special in the first place, it disappears. Nashville was a city I genuinely loved. The first time I went there, I was researching a story about Hank Williams. It was on my first major trip through the American South. From Nashville, I continued into Alabama, following the trail of Hank Williams, who was born and raised there. Back then, Nashville was the country music capital, period. There was Broadway with its bars where fantastic bands played for tips. And of course, there was the Grand Ole Opry, the closest thing country music had to a national stage. Although, if we are honest, the Opry was always basically an American version of a traditional folk music variety show. Even the characters greeting visitors outside the Opry made that clear. A guy dressed up like Porter Wagoner in one of those completely insane rhinestone country suits. And a woman dressed as Minnie Pearl with her straw hat and famous price tag dangling from it. But Nashville had a wonderful vibe. It was really a fairly small city with just a little stretch of Broadway. Over the years, I went back to Nashville many, many times for different stories. One time I did a piece about the musicians who play in the bars along Broadway. These were people performing on tiny stages who were genuinely brilliant, yet still had to fight every single night just to make a living from their music. I remember one specific band whose name I've long forgotten, but one of the musicians, I think it was the bass player, he toured with Dolly Parton on a regular basis. World tours, big stages. And yet there he was, playing for tips on Broadway. He said something that has stayed with me ever since. Today the chicken, tomorrow the feathers. I can't think of a better description of a musician's life. With every visit, I felt the city was losing something. Nashville kept getting bigger, more motels, more entertainment, more staging, more spectacle. Today Nashville calls itself Music City, USA. And it's true that it's no longer just a country music town. It has become one of the major centers of the American music industry. But in the process, something disappeared. The slightly backwoods character that made Nashville what it was, the uniqueness that country music once had. The Nashville I loved has become too big, too loud, and too much of an entertainment district. I have a long history with Las Vegas also. The first time I went there, it was in 1996 after a research trip through California and Arizona. My base back then was Kingdom, which I've talked about in a former edition of On the Road. And from Kingman, it's less than 2-hour drive to Las Vegas. So I thought, why not take a look? Back then, Vegas was essentially the Strip, the Las Vegas Boulevard. The giant new hotels and casinos were just being built, the Mirage, the MGM Grand, the Treasure Island. Others, like the Bellagio and the Venetian, would come a couple of years later. Of course, everything was artificial, but it was fascinatingly artificial. Replicas of Venetian canals, fake European villages, themed worlds that were completely absurd. At that time, Las Vegas was trying to reinvent itself as a family destination. Suddenly there were attractions for children, which was completely at odds with what Las Vegas has always been. Vegas has always been a little bit sleazy. Even the glamorous Rat Pack version of Las Vegas was mostly an illusion. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, a whiskey in their hands that they almost never drank, high society, big shows, gambling. A few years later, I returned for the World Series of Poker while working on a radio drama. For a while, I played poker myself. Whenever I was in the United States, I'd sit down at a poker table. Whenever I was traveling through California, Arizona, Utah, or Nevada, I spent a few days in Las Vegas. Those were wonderful years. Hotel rooms were incredibly cheap. The business model was simple. As long as you were there, they expected you to lose your money at the gambling table. Poker was different though. Unlike roulette or craps, poker is a skill game. If you're better than the other players, you win in the long run. And I was good enough that I came out ahead, overall at least. Later I did a story about how Las Vegas was trying to become sinful again. Sinful. I interviewed strippers, showgirls, and a porn actress. And of course, that was all part of the performance too. But that was exactly what Vegas was, a city that never seriously pretended to be anything other than an artificial world in the middle of the desert. Then Las Vegas kept getting bigger and bigger. More hotels, more shows, more entertainment, and more drunken crowds staggering along the strips every night. The last time I was there, I was working on a story about Las Vegas and its past, its history. I did the interviews and then I just wanted to leave as quickly as possible. I've never been back. And honestly, I think that's a shame. Because places like that were always part of what fascinated me about America. You have this vast country, the desert, this incredible sense of space. And somewhere, someone finds a patch of land and builds something completely insane that has nothing whatsoever to do with the mainstream. Las Vegas used to be exactly that place. Artificial, absolutely. Sleazy, without question. That was precisely why I kept going back. But eventually in America, the mainstream catches up with places like that. Everything becomes bigger, more professional, and more expensive. The quirky place turns into a product. The product turns into an entertainment machine. Rio de Janeiro is for many people one of the great dream destinations of the world. And for good reasons. Just look at the setting. Copacabana, Ipanema, Sugarloaf Mountain, Christ the Redeemer, towering above the city. But that's only one side of the city. The other side revolves around something Brazilians, especially the people of Rio, the Cariocas, call malandragem. The malandro is a classic figure in Brazilian culture, a charming rogue, a hustler, a small-time trickster, who gets through life with wit, improvisation, and the occasional scam. And in Rio, you run into malandragem everywhere. The last time I was there with my wife and my son, I wanted to visit Christ the Redeemer. We took a cab, an Uber, from our hotel in Copacabana to Cosme Velho, where the Cock Railway begins its climb up to Corcovado. It's a short ride, 10 or 15 minutes, maybe 30 or 40 reais. Instead, the Uber driver billed us for a trip across the bay to Niterói, about 4 times the actual fare. And it took quite a bit of effort to convince Uber that we had never been in Niterói. At one point I finally said, look, I sent you 3 admission tickets for Corcovado. We can't have been on top of Corcovado and in Niterói at the very same time. Another time my son and I were at Apuador Beach between Copacabana and Ipanema. After a while we decided to leave. My flip-flops had disappeared. The guy next to us helpfully explained that the waves must have washed them away. Right. Because if I saw my neighbor's flip-flops being swept out to sea, I'd probably mention it immediately, not wait until an hour later or 2 he started looking for them. I was fairly certain what had happened to them. But I let it go and bought a new pair around the corner. That's Rio too. Some petty thieves steal even your flip-flops while you're sitting at the beach. Talking about the beaches, when most people hear the word beach, they imagine palm trees, sand, the ocean, and as few other people as possible. Copacabana and Ipanema are the exact opposite. During the Brazilian summer, they are absolutely packed. And yes, that has its own appeal. The incredible energy, that constant movement, the vendors, the football games, the music, that chaos is part of what makes Rio feel like Rio. But there's a more serious issue as well, the extreme social inequality that has become physically embedded in the geography of the city. Favelas exist in many Brazilian cities, in all of them actually. But in Rio, wealthy neighborhoods and favelas often sit right next to each other. Copacabana and Ipanema, below Babilonia, Cantagalo and Pavão Pauzinho, climbing the hillsides above them. There are historical reasons for that. Rio expanded southwards from the city centers through Flamengo and Botafogo, then to Copacabana and Ipanema, and eventually toward Barra da Tijuca. The wealthier residents kept moving further south. But the people who worked as domestic servants, cleaners, drivers, and in countless other low-paying jobs also had to live somewhere. So informal settlements grew on the hillsides, usually without walking distance of the wealthy neighborhoods. For me, the problem is not the people who live there, not at all. The problem is that many of these favelas have been shaped for decades by drug trafficking, armed gangs, militias, and violent confrontations with the police. And perhaps Rio disappoints me so much because it was once an astonishing cultural powerhouse. I made a podcast about Oscar Niemeyer, the famous architect, and I've been always a huge fan of Bossa Nova. If you look at Rio in the late 50s and early 60s, it's almost unbelievable how much creative energy was concentrating there at that time. Oscar Niemeyer, Lucio Costa, Roberto Bole Marx, the architects and city shapers, Antonio Carlos Jobim, Jorge Roberto, the Bossa Nova. Rio wasn't just beautiful, it was modern. The city had a vision of what the future could look like and what it could sound like. Rio lost its political centrality when Brasilia became the capital in 1960. Economically, Sao Paulo had already become the country's dominant force. But culturally, Rio lost much of that extraordinary creative momentum as well. You can still go to Beco das Garrafas, the legendary little street where Bossa Nova was born. But what do you hear there? Yesterday's music. Christ the Redeemer, Sugarloaf, Copacabana, Ipanema, the Maracana. Those are places everyone should see. Spend 3 days in Rio, then leave. Go somewhere else, like the Costa do Cacau. That's where I'm heading in the next episode of On the Road. Ciao for now, your Tom Noga.